They say the funniest people often carry the heaviest shadows, but for Don Knotts, the gap between the man and the mask was wider than anyone ever suspected. We all remember him as the high-strung, wide-eyed deputy of Mayberry, a man who made us laugh with a single nervous twitch. Yet, behind the scenes of his greatest successes, Don was navigating a world of quiet pain, hidden rituals, and a secret that he guarded for 3 decades. While the world saw a bumbling hero, those closest to him saw a man haunted by a childhood he couldn't outrun. What was the hidden weight that the skinny, funny man carried in silence? And why did it take a lifetime for the truth to finally surface? Don Knotts' journey did not begin with the bright lights of a television studio, but in the dim, strained atmosphere of a boarding house in Morgantown, West Virginia. Born during the height of the Great Depression, Don's childhood was a masterclass in emotional survival. His father, Jesse, was a man broken by the world, suffering from debilitating schizophrenia and alcoholism. For a young child, the home was not a sanctuary. It was a psychological minefield. Jesse would often experience terrifying episodes, sometimes holding a knife to his own throat or screaming at imagined threats. In this environment, Don learned that being visible was dangerous. He developed a shy, stuttering persona, a way to make himself seem non-threatening to his volatile father. However, he soon discovered a powerful tool: comedy. He realized that if he could crack a joke or make a funny face, the tension in the room would dissipate. Laughter became his shield, a way to manipulate the heavy energy of his household into something tolerable. This was the birth of his iconic, nervous man persona, but it wasn't an act yet. It was a genuine neurological response to trauma. As he grew, these survival mechanisms became hardwired into his personality. He wasn't just playing a character who was scared of his own shadow. He was a young man who had spent his formative years waiting for the next outburst. Even as he began to find success as a ventriloquist and actor, the boy from Morgantown remained tucked away inside him, deeply afraid that the chaos of his youth would eventually catch up to him. He was building a career on the very traits that originated from his deepest pain, creating a paradox that would define his entire adult life. But as Don's fame began to skyrocket, the man who made millions feel safe in Mayberry was becoming increasingly terrified of his own shadow. What was the double life he began to lead as soon as the cameras stopped rolling? By the early 1960s, Don Knotts was a national treasure. His portrayal of Barney Fife on the Andy Griffith Show earned him 5 Emmy Awards and the adoration of millions. On screen, Barney was a lovable blowhard, insecure, overconfident, and hilariously high-strung. The audience assumed that the shaky nature of the deputy was simply brilliant physical comedy. They had no idea that for Don, the shaking was often real. During his years in Mayberry, Don lived in a state of constant psychological siege. He suffered from severe hypochondria and crippling anxiety attacks. The stability and warmth of the fictional town of Mayberry stood in stark contrast to the internal storm Don navigated every night. He became obsessed with his health, convinced that every minor ache was a terminal symptom. This was a direct psychological echo of his father's instability. Don lived in fear that he, too, would eventually lose his mind or his life without warning. To cope, he began a secret routine. While his co-stars were out at parties or enjoying the perks of fame, Don was often visiting specialists in secret. He maintained a flawless professional reputation, never late, always prepared, but the cost was immense. He was essentially performing twice, once for the cameras as Barney, and once for the world as a normal, happy man. He felt that if the public knew their favorite deputy was struggling with mental health, the illusion of Mayberry would be shattered. He trapped himself in a cycle of perfectionism, believing that his value was tied entirely to his ability to remain on, even when he felt like he was falling apart. Just as he reached the pinnacle of TV stardom, Don made a choice that shocked his co-stars and fans alike. A decision that many believed was a career mistake, but was actually a desperate attempt to escape his own mind. At the height of his success, Don Knotts did the unthinkable. He left the Andy Griffith Show. On the surface, the move was about a film contract with Universal Pictures, but psychologically, it was an escape attempt. He felt that the character of Barney Fife was becoming a cage. The more people loved the nervous deputy, the more Don felt he had to hide the real, nervous man beneath the costume. He hoped that by moving into films like The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, he could reinvent himself or at least find a new rhythm. However, the change in scenery didn't silence the ghosts. In the high-pressure world of feature films, Don's anxiety only intensified. He began to feel like a fraud, a common psychological phenomenon where high achievers feel they don't deserve their success. To combat this, he entered into intensive psychotherapy, a move that was practically unheard of for a major star in that era. For 30 years, Don would spend hours each week in a therapist's office, trying to unpack the baggage of his childhood. This was the beginning of his true double life. In the morning, he was the bumbling hero on a movie set, making hundreds of crew members laugh. In the afternoon, he was a somber, deeply introspective patient, weeping over the memories of his father's house. He guarded this part of his life with intense ferocity. He feared that if his funny came from a place of sadness, people would stop finding him humorous. This created a tragic tension. He was a comedian who was afraid of his own depth. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, always making sure the sad Don never made a public appearance. While he searched for peace in therapy, a new secret was brewing in his personal life, one that involved a series of relationships that mirrored his need for constant validation and his fear of true intimacy. For 30 years, Don Knotts existed in a world of profound compartmentalization. To the public, he was the goofy neighbor or the clumsy lead. To his peers, he was a consummate professional who was somewhat private. But the real Don lived in the quiet hours. His life was governed by strict routines designed to keep his panic at bay. He was a man of high intelligence and serious artistic ambition, yet he felt obligated to play the dim-witted character the public craved. This 30-year period was defined by a quiet, exhausting struggle for equilibrium. He was one of the first major celebrities to commit to long-term mental health care, yet he could never be a spokesperson for it. He lived in a cultural era that viewed mental struggles as a weakness, especially for a man whose job was to provide joy. Consequently, Don became an expert at masking. He could walk into a room, sense the expectations of the people there, and instantly project the light-hearted persona they wanted. Inside, however, he was often calculating his next exit or worrying about his heartbeat. He struggled with intimacy in his marriages, finding it difficult to let his guard down even with his wives. If he wasn't on, he didn't know who he was. This lack of a solid identity outside of performance led to a sense of isolation. He was one of the most recognizable faces in the world, yet he felt that nobody truly saw him. He was a man who lived in the spotlight but existed in the shadows, waiting for a day when he wouldn't feel the need to hide. But the most shocking revelation wouldn't come until Don was facing his final days, when a secret hobby and a final confession would change everything we thought we knew about his simple life. As Don Knotts entered the later stages of his career, a shift began to occur. While he still took roles that played on his nervous persona, he began to spend more time in solitary reflection. It was during this time that he began to write. These weren't the comedy sketches or light-hearted memoirs people expected. Instead, Don was producing deeply personal, almost philosophical reflections on his life and the nature of fear. These writings revealed a man who was a keen observer of human behavior. He wrote about the masks that all people wear, not just actors. He analyzed how his childhood trauma had actually given him a superpower, the ability to read a room and understand the hidden vulnerabilities of others. This is why his comedy was so effective. It wasn't just slapstick, it was rooted in the universal human experience of feeling inadequate. He realized that Barney Fife was essentially a love letter to the vulnerable. By portraying a man who was terrified but still put on his uniform every day, Don was honoring his own struggle. This period of his life was a slow merging of his two identities. Through his writing and continued therapy, he started to accept that his nervousness wasn't a flaw to be hidden, but the very source of his humanity. However, he still kept these writings private, perhaps not yet ready to dismantle the wall he had spent decades building. He remained the funny man to the world, but his internal world was finally becoming one of a whole man. As the end drew near, Don's daughter would witness a final moment of performance that proved just how dedicated he was to his secret, even when he could barely speak. In February 2006, the world prepared to say goodbye to the man who had brought so much laughter to their living rooms. Don Knotts was in a hospital bed in Los Angeles, his body finally giving way to complications from lung cancer. Even in his final hours, the double life remained in effect. When his lifelong friend Andy Griffith came to his bedside, Don, despite his immense pain and weakness, reportedly tried to crack a joke. He wanted to make sure his friend didn't leave the room feeling the weight of the tragedy. After his passing, his daughter, Karen Knotts, began to share the truth about her father. She spoke of a man who was far more complex than the bumbling deputy. She revealed the decades of therapy, the battle with hypochondria, and the quiet, serious man who spent his life trying to heal the wounds of his childhood. The double life wasn't a scandal. It was a heroic effort. Don had spent 30 years working on himself in the dark so that he could continue to provide light for everyone else. The public's reaction was one of profound empathy. Knowing that Don was struggling with anxiety while he made us laugh didn't make him less funny. It made him more courageous. We realized that every time Barney Fife's voice cracked, it was a victory over the silence Don had been raised in. The secret was out. Don Knotts wasn't just a comedian. He was a survivor who had used the shards of his broken childhood to build a mosaic of joy for the rest of the world. But there is one final question that lingers about the man who spent his life making us feel safe in a fictional town. What can Don Knotts' secret life teach us about the masks we all wear in our own lives? The legacy of Don Knotts is no longer just about the laughs he generated, but about the profound human lesson his double life teaches us. He represents the sad clown archetype in its most noble form. Don proved that professional greatness and personal struggle are not mutually exclusive. In fact, for Don, they were two sides of the same coin. His 30 years of secret therapy and his private battles with anxiety were the work that allowed the art to exist. By looking at the full picture of his life, we see a man who took the nervous twitch given to him by trauma and turned it into a cultural icon. He teaches us that we do not have to be fixed to be valuable. Don was never fully free of his anxiety, but he learned to coexist with it. He showed us that the masks we wear, whether they are for our jobs, our families, or our social circles, are often survival tools that we can eventually learn to set down. In the end, Don Knotts' greatest performance wasn't Barney Fife. It was the quiet, steady work of becoming a whole person despite a broken beginning. He was a man of immense depth who was brave enough to stay in the light, even when his internal world was dark. As we revisit the streets of Mayberry, we can now see the deputy with new eyes. We see a man who was terrified, yes, but a man who showed up anyway. Don Knotts lived a double life so that he could give us a better one, leaving behind a legacy of laughter, resilience, and the quiet courage to face our own shadows. Next time you watch an old episode of Mayberry and see Barney Fife fumble with a single bullet, ask yourself, what is the secret you're carrying today, and how can you turn it into your own kind of strength?